I hope you'll be enjoying this wonderful place at Soneva Fushi, and I'm absolutely delighted that we have Sonu with us in the conversation. But equally so, we have Pico Iyer, who has traveled the world uh, for 48 years or so. And I'm going to first welcome Pico to nowhere. This is a quote from his book, The Stillness of Life. But Pico, let me start with you and ask you, there was this time that you write in the beginning of the book, you're driving up, you leave LA, the lights of LA behind you, they recede, and you continue to travel up a gravel path till you get to this hut. And you get off and you're received by.
I'm received by an elderly man, very stooped, with wire-rimmed glasses, in a tattered black robe. I get out of my car. He offers me a very deep bow, though we've never met before. He insists on carrying my little bags to the cabin in which I stay. And as soon as we get there, he starts cooking dinner for me and heating up water for tea. He asks me if I need a wife, though luckily I'm well equipped on that front already. And it takes me the longest time to realize that this is my hero already of 30 years, Leonard Cohen, who at the age of 61 is living for 5 years in a Zen monastery in the high, cold, dark mountains behind Los Angeles. And I was just telling to some new friends, putting himself through this back-breaking regimen, shoveling snow, scrubbing floors, and the time I was visiting, as you know, mid-December, late December, very cold, almost snow on the ground, 7 days and 7 nights of more or less unbroken meditation. And I was thinking, here's a man who could be doing anything in the world with anyone he wants, and he has found this to be, as he put it, the most voluptuous adventure that the world has to offer.
What was really interesting was to read one of his comments where he said, the greatest entertainment in life is stillness.
Yes, and he sampled all the alternatives richly. So yes, that was a humbling thing for me to realize as somebody who's constantly traveling. But I think, more important, it spoke to some intuition or longing that we have in all of us. Because even I, when I was in my late 20s, I was living the life I might have dreamed of as a little boy. An apartment in Park Avenue in New York City, chance to write on world affairs for Time magazine, travel here and there, really stimulating colleagues. And a part of me thought, I'm having such a good time, I can't really tell how deep the happiness goes. And it's so intoxicating, I might well wake up and realize I'm 70 years old, and I've never really lived. And so at that time, I decided, again, as you know, to go the other direction and move to a temple in Kyoto, Japan, because I thought whatever happened or didn't happen there, it would be a corrective and a complement to my life in high-paced New York City. And although my high-minded year in a temple in Japan only lasted a week, 35 years later, my wife and I still live in a rented 2-room apartment, never used a cell phone, we don't have a car, we don't have a bicycle. And it's our attempt to live the life that Sonu and Eva are so generously sharing with and promulgating across the world. And just that sense that the world is accelerating with every moment, and we're trying to live at a pace determined by machines, and humans can't live at that pace unless we become machines ourselves. And I remember, I'll stop babbling in a minute, but I remember when I began writing, there was a real sense that people were craving information. And now I feel what we're most craving is freedom from information, the chance to step out of the fray and really to remember what we love. And it struck me during the pandemic, almost all the world was living in an enforced retreat, and for all the grief and loss, I think almost every human being suddenly remembered what she really cares about most and has started to reorient her life differently in the light of the stillness that we all shared at that time. So in our little way, in our tiny apartment in nowhere, Japan, we try to live no shoes, no news.
And in your discovering of stillness, what was the expression that you found? I mean, your latest book has these beautiful paintings of the sea, of mountains, of sunsets, of sunrises. But in your stillness, what was your sort of key message?
I think the main thing is remembering what I love. Because there's so much going on in all our lives. I feel the problem with a cluttered mind or a cluttered desk or a cluttered schedule is that there's lots that's trivial, and there's a little that's essential, and the essential gets buried in the trivial. And again, as you know, I once lost my house and everything I own in a forest fire. And ever since, I've thought, if the waves or the flames were approaching us now, and we had 5 minutes to evacuate, how would we put our hands on what's most important? And if there's too much in our lives, we can't do so. In a 2-room apartment, it's relatively easy, because there's almost nothing there except what we care about. And so Sonu was asking me yesterday about my meditation practice, and I had to confess I'm an imposter because I don't have one, but I've made more than 100 retreats at a Catholic monastery, even though I'm not a Christian. And the reason I do so is that every time I return, I know what I should be doing for the next several months. And I remember really what is closest to my heart, which when I'm racing from the freeway to the shopping mall to the pharmacy, I quickly lose sight of.
Sonu, Eva and you chose to be here. And in the time that you chose to be here, it was very isolating. There was nothing in this area. There was a former sort of resort, perhaps, on this particular island. But you made that choice. It was a very distinct choice that you made, very different from the choice that you had of running, as you did, the Six Senses group earlier. What was that core thing that made you say, this is where we're going to plant our flag, and this is where home is going to be, in the middle of nowhere?
Right. Hello?
Yeah.
Hi. So I think it's separate things. So, we opened Soneva Fushi before Six Senses. So the decision to sell Six Senses and focus on Soneva was more about being both the owner and operator of our hotel, so we could have that clear philosophy drive through all our properties. When you're managing other people's hotels and have people investing over $100 million on an asset, they obviously want to have a say on these sort of issues, which for us are very important, like the no news, no shoes bag, that people walk barefoot. So we'd have challenges with third-party owners where we were just the hotel operator using our Six Senses brand, trying to explain to them that it's these little touches that really make the difference. You build a structure, but it's a bit like having the iPhone without the apps. It's pointless. So we were getting more and more challenges about the no news, no shoes philosophy, and they were saying, God, this is ridiculous that people have to walk barefoot. And then things like changing the time when you arrive. So I mean, and it creates the context. So if you think about it, you're quite stressed. You've arrive in Male, you're in the lounge. Okay, you de-stressed a little bit. You come on the float plane. It's a lovely experience landing in the water, but it's like any other hotel experience. But what really sort of sets the context, in my opinion, is the fact that sorry, excuse me. Before you come on the island, we've taken your shoes from you and put it in a shoe bag, so you're walking barefoot and you're slowing down, going to different contexts. Walking barefoot, by the way, is also very healthy for you. There's a lot of studies on the benefits of the feet touching the earth in terms of the electromagnetic field, and they recommend if you don't live in a context like this, they do recommend at least at home you walk barefoot, and if you can just walk in your garden. It's better when you walk in nature, in raw soil, than just in your apartment, because you actually get the benefits from the ground. So we do that. Then the no news, no shoes. So we obviously have televisions in our rooms, but they're well hidden under trunks, and so often we have guests in the guest satisfaction survey suggesting that we introduce a TV into the room. They don't realize that it's hidden under a trunk or behind a door in a wall or whatever. And but we don't have cable TV, because you have to control your media, and we know today most media is biased. It's to sell to sell volume. So bad news sells, good news doesn't, and we get this terrible perception that the world is, for example, a more dangerous place, because when you turn CNN on, it's always breaking news, and the breaking news isn't about some fantastic achievement that someone's just done, some peace accord, or some fantastic creativity. It's about someone blowing someone up or shooting 5 or 10 people and so on, because that sells. So we deliberately do that, and it's a suspension of disbelief. So if you think about Shakespeare's plays. He creates these plays within the play to create this suspension of disbelief, like sort of Midsummer Night's Dream and, you know, Bottom's play, etc. And so you see the players playing a play, and so then they become real, and you suspend this disbelief. So, and it's the same way with the holiday. You know, you come on here, we take your shoes off, you're walking barefoot, we're controlling your media in that, you know, we don't offer it any. You can watch a movie if you want. And we're trying to sort of minimize the impact, you know, Wi-Fi and things like that. So you actually are more grounded. And we find that as a result of that, the stays are longer and the repeat business is higher. So Soneva Fushi is where I think that value is at its highest. Our repeat level here, and it was always the case with Soneva. So Soneva's, it was one of our metrics we followed. We have our key performance indicators. I mentioned yesterday, you have to count what counts, and that drives behavior. So one of them is, you know, we have a very strong guest focus, and one measure is repeat business. At Six Senses, we were very seldom above 5-10% return business, even though we're in locations where people could come back regularly because they were traveling short haul, you know, just a couple of hours to get there. The Sonevas are normally in long haul destinations, and our repeat levels are much higher. Here, more than 50% of our guests are return guests.
But Sonu, what is
so it
your
creates
own
that, yeah.
discipline in terms
Yeah.
of finding the stillness? Because
Yeah.
what you've been able to do is not just do this as a physical property, of course.
Yeah.
The beauty of the design is amazing, but you've also been able to impart it to everybody here.
Yeah, yeah. No, so we're a big believer in meditation. It's a pity you don't do it. I hope you'll practice it here. We have some great meditation practitioners. But it's something I encourage amongst all our teams. So firstly, I believe as a leader, you have to walk in the morning and turn the light bulb on. If you're not doing that because you've just got out of bed and you're conditioned by some argument you had with someone the night before or something you read, you're really doing your team a disservice, and you're not really a true leader. For me, that's the first job, is to inspire and motivate and invigorate people. And to do that, you have to be grounded yourself. So I never do it, and I hope our senior leadership, because it's something we drum home again and again and again, I never walk into a meeting. So my first call always starts at 10 in the morning, because, you know, I'll get up like this morning about 6:37, do some emails, and I just went on a boot camp, that's why I'm sweating a bit. We were on the sandbank. It was great fun. By the way, tomorrow morning there's a boot camp on the sandbank at 8, so if anyone would like to do that, it's when the weather's like this, it's just one of the most beautiful things to do. So I either do some exercise or yoga, and then I'll meditate for half an hour and program myself. Also, you know, a bit of gratitude, being grateful for things, being happy with what one has, putting oneself in the right frame of mind. I don't know if you've read that book by Harold Abrahams, The Book of Joy, where he spent a week in Dharamsala with the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Tutu, and he talks about these 8 pillars of joy, you know, acceptance, forgiveness, compassion,
Empathy.
empathy, exactly, and gratitude, and there are these 8 joys. So, you know, I try and sort of meditate on one of those 8 pillars, you know, just for 5-10 minutes, and then the rest is just the breathing, following my breathing and getting myself grounded so I can walk into a meeting. And for our hosts, they're meant to do the same. And the other thing is, I touched upon it last weekend, and I touched upon it yesterday as well. The essence of luxury in a hotel is the service. And I talked about magical service last evening, but also you need to have stillness yourself as a service host. You need to be a good listener. So you need to, radical listening is all about eliminating all thoughts from your mind and just listening to the person in front of you and trying to detect with every little sort of hair off your skin and your sensitivity what that other person is facing. And that's really service at its best. So our hosts need to practice meditation because they need to practice to be able to still the mind so that they're good listeners. If they don't do that, they're not great waiters or barefoot guardians, etc. So meditation is, for us, is a huge tool and very important. Mark Happelsmann, the CEO of Hyatt, is trying to institute that in Hyatt, meditation. But of course, it's difficult. You know, he's got a big
Meditation
chain
in a
and lots of
multi-story hotel, I suspect, is not going to happen when you're trying to turn housekeeping around in 14 minutes or 4 minutes or whatever. But Pico, you know, Sonu talked about meditation, and one of the things you talk about in this book is that there was a survey done of these people who went into retreat and meditated, and what that did to them as opposed to another controlled group who didn't do meditation, didn't have access to it.
Well, I'll admit I don't remember that particular survey, but I do remember that they surveyed people recently, and they found people were working fewer hours than in the 1960s, but felt that they were working more, which was a sign that something fundamental is out of sync. And I loved what Sonia was saying about the Dalai Lama, because 10 times in 12 years recently, I traveled across Japan with the Dalai Lama by his side every minute of the day.
Oh, wow.
And, you know, in his private meetings and having lunch with him every day. And at the end of each day, I'm 22 years younger than he. I was absolutely exhausted. And I thought, you know, from 8:30 in the morning to 4:30 in the afternoon, he never stopped. And his hosts would
And he wakes up at 3:30 to begin with.
Well, that's the secret, exactly. And I realized that while I was enjoying my beauty sleep and having seconds at the buffet breakfast, he was spending the first 4 hours of every day meditating to collect his resources for the challenges to come. And I thought, if the busiest person I know can devote 4 hours every day, surely I and most of us could do 20 minutes at least. So I don't do formal meditation, but my wife would say all I spend my life doing as a writer is meditating, because I wake up, I go into a room, and I just sit there for 8 hours, no computer or anything there, trying to cut through my illusions and projections and hear the voice beyond my chatter. So sometimes I tell people, if you're scared of formally embarking on meditation, you can still just sit away from your devices and clear your head, and, as you say, learn to listen and learn to focus. And I loved it when you were talking about turning on the lights, because I remember I met the Dalai Lama the day after he was awarded the Nobel Prize. And he was in California with a group of scientists, typically. And as soon as I went in, you know, bothering him on the busiest day of his life, he said, you know, would you like to sit here, or would this be better, or are you comfortable? As if, you know, I was the dignitary and he was the intrusive journalist. And we had and then he turned to me and he said, I've just won all this money, what should I do? And he was clearly going to ask every person he met, however young and inexperienced as I was, for advice. But the thing that really has stayed with me 34 years later is that at the end of this conversation, he led me back to the front door. And then he said, oh, I've forgotten something. And he went back and he said, turn off the light. And he said, it's such a tiny thing, and it's not religious, but if more and more people remember those kind of tiny gestures, that's the only way we'll save the planet. And I feel, you know, coming here, that's what you're all about.
Turning on the light in terms of, and he's a perfect example of that. I've only seen him once in real life, and, you know, I was about 10 rows back, and he walked onto the stage. The moment he walked into the room, you know, he really did turn the light on. People stopped their chatter. There was a stillness, there was silence, and we were all completely focused.
An
incredible aura. You know, this aura walks into the room, and I think that's what meditation does and helps. And to answer the question, there have been many surveys, not just one. There are many surveys now about the benefits of meditation, and the various books like Jeffrey Rudiger, Cured, he refers to it. There's a lovely book about radical hope and radical remission, an American MD who follows people who've radically cured themselves from chronic diseases, in particular cancer, but also other diseases. And even Joe Dispenza talks about this as well. You are the placebo, and they cite lots of research on this, in that the study of epigenetics, where it's, you know, what we're learning now is that you're born with genes. So everyone thinks, oh, we have this DNA, and that's why we have these illnesses, and we have no choice. But it's not true. You make your lifestyle and your choices create your health and your well-being. And so what you think changes your DNA. Because
which is exactly what Dr. Sharad Paul was saying to us last week.
He was, yeah.
Exactly that.
I see. I didn't
that you were
attend the
born
session.
with that, but you can then find ways to be able to overcome it. So if you have a fat gene that you're born
you're
with,
sending messages down. So you're sending chemical messages into your DNA, and you can send positive messages. So Joe Dispenza, who's got a huge following, you might have heard of him. People go and throng to his sessions, and they meditate and they cure themselves from all sorts of things. It's a bit like a Jesus sort of scenario. American individual who was a osteopath, and he was competing in a triathlon, the bicycle bit. He comes out of this small lane into a big highway, and the police were, allowing the cyclists. And this lady just ignored the policeman, went past the policeman, hit him up the back at about 60 miles an hour. He found himself on his back, and the doctor said, well, you'll never walk or perform, sports like you used to, and you'll never be able to do a marathon, but at least you'll be able to walk if you do this operation. And being an osteopath, he knew the consequences. So he refused. And over nine weeks, he willed himself to fix himself. So he's on his back, and then on his front a lot of the time, because it's painful to be on the back. And he meditated, and 10 weeks later, he was in his practice, and 12 weeks later, he was in the gym, just from this meditation. Sorry, Pico, would you like... Here we go, yeah.
That's so thoughtful, thank you.
Yeah, and there's a cold towel as well. No, I'm fine, but yeah.
I will help.
Yeah, and so thank you, Jane. There's a lot of studies on that and cancer patients, and because meditation helps you create positive thoughts, and that's what Joe does. So Dr. Joe does in his
And
sessions.
is that something you did too when you were unwell?
Absolutely. I believe quite strongly in that. I'm much better now. As you know, I had cancer twice now. So the second time, this time when it came back, I was much more focused on my meditation and breath work. And so we have Alan Doolin on site. I don't know if you've had a session with him. I know some of our guests did. I've been to a few breathwork specialists. I've read the book by James Nestor, his ideas. And I've also attended the Swami Rama ashram. And Swami Rama, you might have known about him. He was famous for willing cancer into his body. So he meditated, cancer
leaching
appeared,
the cancer.
tumors, yeah, and then he got rid of it. And I follow his breath practice, where you breathe in for 4 and then you exhale for much longer. And I actually think about him doing that, and I feel I'm sort of killing anything that's there.
4, 6, and 8. So you breathe in
Yeah.
on whatever count you
Yeah.
want to, 4 to 6 to 7, then you hold it for a count of 7, and then you breathe out.
Yeah.
But Pico,
Refer to the waves, yeah.
Yep.
If you follow the waves of the sea, yeah.
Pico, coming back to, everybody here has traveled on some flight to come here, and they'll travel back, and many of us continue to travel across the world. You sort of came to a conclusion in your travels, in your airline travels, as to what to do. Earlier, you used to race through a book or watch movies or whatever, but now, what do you do?
Well, I never forget I was on a sort of 11-hour flight from Munich to Los Angeles, and there was a young woman next to me, and I sat down and checked the video monitors and got into my book. She just sat there, and sat there, and sat there, and sat there for 12 hours. She didn't sleep, she didn't read a book, she didn't watch any movies, she just sat there. And then, as we were about to land, I picked up the courage and I said, I'm so impressed by this quality of stillness and concentration. And she said that she's a busy social worker in Germany. She gets 1 holiday a year in Hawaii. And so wisely, she uses the long flight over just to gather herself, to collect herself, to cleanse herself of all the toxins she's acquired in her very stressful job. And so when she arrives in Hawaii, she's ready to move into sort of sunlight and clarity. And it made such an impression on me that whenever I'm flying from the East Coast to the West in the US now, I leave the East Coast at 5 or 6 in the evening, and it's about a 6-hour flight, as you know, and I deliberately do nothing. Sometimes I'm sleepy, that's what my body is calling for. Sometimes I'm not, and I'll make notes, but I deliberately just use that time as a 6-hour empty space. And it's remarkable how the next morning, whatever I've done or haven't done, I wake up so much clarified and refreshed. And when Sonu was talking about his diagnosis, which I was recently reading about, I think for me that's almost the most essential justification for stillness. I remember during the pandemic, my mother was rushed into a hospital, losing blood. She was 88 years old, didn't have long to live. I had to fly across the world to be with her. And we all face those situations often. And as I was sitting by her in her bedside, I was thinking, what can I do to help my poor mother and to sustain myself in this life or death situation? My bank account wasn't really going to be much help. My resume, useless. Even all the books I've read, all the books I've written, weren't really going to help my mother. And I felt the only thing I could bring to that situation was whatever I'd gathered within, which wouldn't come from racing around and flying around, but would come from whatever I'd developed, the inner resources, the inner savings bank, I suppose, I'd gathered by being quiet. And I loved what Sonu was saying about what he instills in all the hosts here, because every one of us in this room has had the experience. You meet somebody who's just been driving on the freeway, he's been multitasking, he's been doing 6 things at once. He comes into the room, he's so jangled, he's not good for anything. And you really can't carry on a conversation, you can't get business or pleasure done. And maybe that afternoon, a woman comes into your room and she's just spent the previous 30 minutes sitting quietly in her office. And she brings such a clarity and such a calm to that room, it's infectious. And I think that's probably what your hosts are bringing to us, that through their meditation practice, as you were saying, they develop the stillness that all of us benefit from. It's a contagious thing.
Yeah.
Happily.
Thank you.
Sonu, he talked about it, contagious thing, trying to find that stillness.
Yeah.
You have guests who come from across the world, from Russia, from China, from Europe, from America, from India. Is there a difference in the way that each of these people from each of these different places take to a place like this, which is coming to nowhere?
I think it's difficult to generalize. But I think the market that Funny AF has the deepest emotional response, one of the markets are the Russians. There are certain Russians that are just completely touched by this. Because if you think about it, they come from a very hard context. I don't know if you've been to Moscow. I mean, I haven't been for about 4 years, since prior to the pandemic. But it was very beautiful because Putin invested a lot in Moscow for the World Cup, etc. But it's still a very harsh city. The Russians are quite tough and brusque. And so I think for them, the contrast is just so strong. So, yeah.
And Pico, you've traveled so many parts of the world. And again, you talk about, of course you can travel. But if you just stay in that one place, whether it's in your home or wherever, look at the wall, and that nowhere travel is really what opens up your mind, your creativity, your spirituality, your connection.
Yeah, and I really experienced it during the pandemic, and I'm sure many other people did. So when my mother was ill, my wife and I went to stay with her in her house for 6 months. And of course, we weren't traveling as much as we usually would, and our health club was closed. We still needed exercise. So every morning, we'd just take a walk on the road behind my mother's house. Very, very early, the sun was showing up over the mountains, flooding the hills with golden light. Other parts of the valley were in deeper shadow, and we'd turn around and we'd see the ocean just scintillant in the distance. So clear you could sort of count the ridges in the hills and the islands. And I would realize this is as beautiful as anything I'd go halfway across the world to see in Cape Town or Rio de Janeiro. Here it is in the road of my mother's house. And my parents had been in that house more than 50 years. I'd never walked to the end of the road, just 20 minutes away, till the pandemic forced it. And it was just a reminder that what we all know, but so easily forget, that you don't have to travel far to be transformed. And I bet most of the people here during the pandemic were taking walks or stuck in their neighborhood.
Including me, I found my neighborhood, which I hadn't for 20 years.
And wonders and beauties in your neighborhood you would sleepwalk past or would never think to look for.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah, how one sort of ignores, one travels so far around the world, but to discover new
What
places,
you have,
but
right.
one doesn't know one's home. Yeah.
Yes. And I remember actually, because we live a pretty slim, scaled-down life in Japan, just as far as our feet will take us. And a friend, before the pandemic, sent me this great quote from John Burroughs, the American naturalist, saying, if you want to see a fresh sight, take the same walk every day. And it's all about attentiveness. That I know as a traveler, any trip is made not by what you see, but by how you see it. And all 3 of us might look at the same thing. One of us is tired and sees nothing, and the other of us is fresh and is exhilarated and transformed, maybe. And so it's really just a matter of, I love the old German philosopher Meister Eckhart said, if the inner work is strong, the outer work will never be puny. Whether it's relationships or business life or whatever, once you've taken care of this part, the rest takes care of itself, I feel.
I remember once the Dalai Lama saying to us that I am nothing special. I'm just here by accident, and my best PR company is actually the Chinese because they keep wanting to ban me wherever I go, so that's what's made me famous. But that's not entirely true. When, as Sonu said, the Dalai Lama enters the room, you do feel transformed by his comments, by even, I remember when he comes to do his nosy thing, he rubs his nose when he comes to you. that in itself is in many ways a blessing. So what is it that has made him so special? Was he born, or of course he was reborn in the tradition, but was he born with this knowledge which was then opened up? Has he acquired this knowledge? Has it sort of rested in him in a particular way?
It's such a good question. And as you say, of course, there's something special. It's remarkable that this boy who was born in a cowshed 3 hours from the nearest town to a mother who couldn't even read or write and who lost 9 of her 16 children when young would suddenly become this person absolutely at ease in the White House and the European Parliament and the global platform. But I think he would say whatever you see in him is a reflection of the possibility in each of us. And that's a much more hopeful thing. In other words, the clarity and presence that Sonu was describing is largely the result of his meditation practice. And he would say, if you're getting something from my sense of attentiveness and warmth, that's a reflection of you. That's what you have the capacity to do. Any one of you, regardless of your religion or lack of religion, which is really, it's a hopeful thing and it's an absolutely democratic thing. Do you feel that? Or
Yeah,
that,
yeah, no, absolutely. No.
I mean, everyone can potentially. And, you know, as I say, it's part of his job to do 4 hours every day, and none of us is the Dalai Lama. But in our tiny ways, in our different contexts, if we can make that first step, only good things are going to happen. Right?
Yes, no, exactly. And I think I was, as you were saying that, I was just thinking I should really try it, try and do 4 hours of meditation each morning for a week and see how that changes things. But
Or do nothing, as you
Yeah.
said, or do just nothing
Right, yeah.
for 4 hours every
Right,
day
yeah.
and see how that opens up your mind.
yeah.
But
I-
Sonu, he was talking about possibilities and potential.
Yeah.
And you're able to unlock possibilities and potential as you've done in the Sonevas across the world. And you've also made sure that it's in many ways gifted to others who would like to discover the possibilities and
Yeah.
potential. So again, what is in you that has made you trigger this or leverage the possibility and the potential of a bit of sand like this?
So what is it?
What is it in you?
Right. That's allowed
I'm not
me to
talking
leverage
about
that.
you're not talking about the management practice, but what is inside you
Right.
that is allowed or for this leveraging of the
Right.
possibilities and potential of where we are this sand.
Right. I suppose it's a reflection of. I mean, what we're creating is a reflection of our experience, isn't it? Like any artist, they're creating. It's a reflection of their own experience and their views and so on. So I've always I've spent a lot of my life in an agricultural environment. Funny enough, so when I was at pre-prep school, my father used to take me out a lot. So I was a terrible student because for 6 months, sometimes I'd miss 2 terms. And I had, my father was building this farm in Nigeria. So I was out on a farm and I had a tutor who'd come on a donkey to teach me. And this was like in the north of Nigeria, very close to the Sahara Desert. It was very north of Kano, if you know the geography of Nigeria. And it was a very remote area. And I suppose that that's experience makes me love this type of environment and an uncluttered environment and, just bringing the best out of nature. And I think at Soneva, that's what we believe very strongly in is the fact that we always deliberately choose incredible settings. So we say no a lot of the time in terms of locations, opportunities, because we want just the perfect place. So I don't know if you've been to Soneva Jani, but Soneva Jani is, you haven't been there. No, it's an amazing lagoon. It's the island, the main island is like 1.5 times the size of this. There's 6 other islands. It's huge. But it took us we sold Soneva Gili back in 2011. And we bought that island in 2014. So it was about 3 years to find the right island. So we find these really beautiful places. And then the idea is to really bring out the beauty of the nature where we are. So we're just building a new one, which will open at the end of the year. And it's amazing. It's one atoll, one island. So it's like, this is an atoll. It's a smaller atoll. But there's just one resort, which is us. And there's just a big local island, but that's 10 kilometers away. So with a naked eye, you just can't see that local island. And that's it. And so incredible environment, and the whole experience is geared towards, being in that incredible lagoon, that atoll, discovering it. It's very much about destination dining, where every villa will have a barefoot guardian, an assistant, and a chef. There'll be a chef de partie for each villa, and different nationalities. So you'll have 14 different nationalities. So because it's only 15 rooms, so if you want
You can mix them
Thai
up.
food, you can swap the chef de partie with the Vietnamese, the guests who have the Vietnamese chef de partie, because hopefully they won't. And each chef will be taught 3 neighboring foods. So so hopefully we'll try it out. But it's very much about creating these experiences in these remote locations. And so so I think it was that time in Nigeria. And every morning my father we used to wake up quite early, about 6, and he used to do a tour of each section. It was 10,000 acres, so he'd do about 1,500 acres each morning for about 2-3 hours. It was initially a Land Rover, and then we had the first Range Rover in '72. And I was 7, he taught me how to drive. So I would then drive, and he'd sit in the passenger seat with the station manager. We'd have these, each 2,000 acre bit had a station manager and the assistant station manager. And they were very nervous about this driving. But it was, and then afterwards, whenever I had a break, I'd sort of because all the farmers just left the keys in the car, because there was, it was a very remote area. The nearest village was 20 miles away. So I'd always just go around, take a car, drive for about, half an hour, and then drop it somewhere else, pick up the other person's car. So these people would be in the fields, they'd come back to their car, and the car would have gone, but someone else's car was there. And so, but, so that was the environment. So I've always been, I had a little Bambi, a little deer, because some hunters killed the mother. So I had a little baby deer. We had 10,000 snakes on the farm that were caught. My father used to give a reward of $1. I mean, it's Nigeria, so perhaps they recycle the snakes. I don't know, but he paid out $10,000 for these snakes. So yeah.
And what happened to the snakes? What did you do?
Oh no, they were then killed. Yeah. So it was they were big, quite big. Yeah.
So I was thinking, actually, to follow on from what Sanjoy was saying, as you were saying, the Hyatt and lots of other places, everyone wants to incorporate mindfulness and meditation now.
Yeah.
But you, 30 years ago, from the outset, that was such an important thing, I think, for both you and Eva, from what I've read.
I think anything you do has to come from the heart, and then you can create a difference. You can't just bolt it on. So I was at a hotel, a sort of a luxury conference, the FT conference on luxury. And I was on a panel with the CEO of Versace, and the conversation was about luxury and sustainability. And he was saying, we've just hired a sustainability officer. And that was it, It's like, I tick the box and that's it. And and it has to come from the core, everything,
Before I open it up, one last thing, through the first weekend into the week, one of the things that the filmmakers and the writers and all of us have been talking about is that if you have a definitive ending, it's very boring and it doesn't necessarily solve any purpose. So every film, every book should have the infinite possibility of not really having an ending. So, you may have a larger goal, which you work towards, but you don't necessarily have to have an exact ending. Any thoughts?
Well, every book is ultimately is a pale reflection of the book it should have been and could have been. But beyond that, I've found in any project, only about 2/3 of the way through do I realize what it should have been all along. And then the question is, do you have the courage as an artist or writer to go back and start again in the light of what you found? But you're right, there shouldn't be an ending. And even if you complete a book that you're happy with, that's only an opening to the next book that has to push you further. I mean, I love the way Shaker ended his discussion the other day about arriving there brilliantly prepared, except for the moment. And then he has to not know what's going to come to be surprised by it. And it's only if you as a writer are surprised by what comes out that the reader will be surprised. So no, it's a lovely, rich notion, I think.
So I think a couple of things. So I believe in this idea of Emerson that there's no end, every end is a new beginning. And I think that attitude is good. And this idea of Einstein, you have to give up who you are to become who you will. And I think that's very important. I think one shouldn't be concerned about change, changing one's life, because that does create the opportunity for new things to happen. So it's not like, you set up a business like Six Senses and that's the end. You leave yourself the possibility of new beginnings. So there's that. But with hotels, I think our big success has been precisely that, because traditionally in our industry, you have hotels that are, a majority of the hotels, so all our competitors here in the Maldives, I think, yeah, I'd say about, most probably, I can't think of one that's not. All our competitors in the Maldives are owned by institutions. It could be local family in the Maldives, it could be a sovereign wealth fund, it could be a financial institution, it could be a listed hotel company, like hotel properties that own, Soneva Gili, the old Soneva Gili and the Six Senses Lamu and the Four Seasons properties here. So they're the institutional investor, and then you have the hotel operator. So the institutional investor builds it, that's it. There's a 4% of revenues, it's an FF&E reserve, furniture, fixtures, extras reserve, changing the cushions, fixing the wall, repainting the wall, whatever. And that's it. Whereas we've always believed that hotels are living beings, so we always challenge our teams to drive ROIs, returns on investments, because I feel that the more you can invest in your existing properties and achieve incremental revenues or incremental improvements in cost, you achieve the best and safest returns you can ever do. So we're continuously investing in our properties. If you came to Soneva Fushi 20 years ago, it'd be a different place. It's evolved considerably over the last 20 years. So, and I think that's been our success, because we're continuously evolving. This idea of the 60-mile, what do you call it, the 20-mile march, Amundsen, when he went to the North Pole, this idea we'll march at a pace that's fast enough to keep us ahead of our competitors, but slow enough so that we don't get out of breath. So that's one of our SMAC, smart, methodical, and consistent recipes, is the idea of the 20-mile march.
Continuously evolving. Any questions? At the back, Neha wanted to.
Hi, Pico. I was just wondering, you've been exploring this idea of stillness and consciousness in your work for decades now, and you clearly travel the world to read and write and talk about these things. So I suppose my question is a leading question. In your experience in watching the world change over these decades, are we perhaps one of the most distracted generations that you've come across? And do you see a marked difference as you've been exploring these ideas through the years?
Radically. And I would say the good part of that is we are also the generation most craving clarity and liberation from these destructive habits we've got into. I've read, for example, in Singapore, people walk 30% faster than they did in 1994. And Singapore's not the fastest city in the world if you've been to Hong Kong or New York.
They're walking 30% faster?
Yeah,
Really?
yeah,
wow.
yeah. And then, I've also heard, as many of us have, that it takes 25 minutes fully to recover your concentration after a phone call. And the average person in a room such as this receives a phone call every 11 minutes. So you're literally never caught up. So I'm an old fogey, I've never used a cell phone, and because I functioned very happily in 1993 before there was an internet or a cell phone, and I cling jealously to my old habits. And I'm lucky because I don't have kids. If I did, I would, of course, have to have a cell phone. We're faster now than we were 3 years ago, and it's only moving in one direction. So the only thing that can liberate us from that is ourselves, as both Sonu and Sanjoy have been saying. It's not as if the machines are corrupting us, it's that we don't use them discerningly or with restraint enough. Which again, I think is a place of possibility. Each one of us has the capacity to do what Sonu was saying about, when you wake up, how are you going to direct your day? And just as Sonu was also saying, I felt during the pandemic, this is a little different from, during the pandemic, every day when I woke up, I thought, will I be frustrated by what I'm missing out on, or will I be glad for the fact that I and my wife are still healthy and we're still getting to take walks? It's very much a choice you can make. And every day when I woke up, I thought, do I want to turn on my emails and read the news, which, just as Sonu was saying, is only going to cut me up and make me feel powerless? 6,000 people have tested positive in Iran, the mortuaries in Bolivia are overflowing. It's tragic stuff, but I didn't feel there's anything I could do about it. Or would I look up and out and get flooded with possibility? In other words, again, entirely a choice that we have, how we're going to direct ourselves and our attention towards that which opens us up or that which closes us down. But I do see a very, very dramatic change. And if I were a professor, I think I would have the empirical evidence for attention spans shrinking.
Question for both of you. In a still life, when you are, so personally invested and looking after yourself via meditation and thought, how does one scale that life in terms of, Sonu maybe increasing your footprint in terms of new hotels, and Pico in terms of reaching new audiences? How do you reconcile the two?
Oh, I see. Growth versus still life. Yeah, you're right, because if you're growing too aggressively, you don't have time anymore. I always, I think focus. For me, it's focus. Just being very clear on what I'm going to focus my time on, because there's a limited amount of time I have. And so Bruce, who's here, our CFO, is there. We have a thing called Learning from the Core every week. One of our core members shares for an hour in a webinar their learning. And last Thursday, he talked about intentionality and the importance of, just being very clear about where you spend your time, because the time is so valuable. We talked about it earlier as well. So I think for me, it's just focus, just the ability to say no to opportunities, and ensuring that whatever time you spend is focused on what will be the most meaningful for us.
Yes, and I feel as a writer, my job is to gauge the longings of a potential audience. And when I began writing, I would write very fast and kind of MTV prose to entertain people. Now we've joined an entertainment universe, and there's so much coming in on us all the time. I feel my job is to free people from that and stretch their attention span and give them a sense of spaciousness that at some level they may be craving in their lives. And so therefore, I feel the more I sit still and the more I try to awaken some kind of intimacy, the more grateful the occasional reader would be. And of course, I know there are far fewer readers now than when I began writing 40 years ago, but I also know that the people who are reaching for books are reaching for attentiveness, intimacy, and nuance. And so it's my responsibility, actually, to be very, very quiet and undistracted so that I can give the deepest part of me to try to evoke the deepest part of them.
One last question, if any. Anybody?
Thank you. I think many of us feel so relaxed being here and are sort of dreading going back to real life. Isn't it the case that the majority of people are not able to live a still life because they need to make a living and they can't do the things that you're talking about? So how can you bring stillness to the vast majority of people in this world who are very poor and are having to struggle every day to survive?
I think the typical work day is normally about 8 hours. If you're at that level and you're struggling financially and you're working for someone else, normally the working hours are 8 hours. You still have the other 16 hours, and you can determine how you manage those 16 hours. And unfortunately, more and more in most jobs, especially in the service industry, you have an option. People are and businesses and leaders are offering people more autonomy in what they do. So it's up to you to manage your day. And so, for example, as Pico said, you could opt, as the Dalai Lama does, to just sleep for 4 hours and meditate for 4 hours rather than sleeping for 8 hours, because he finds that's more invigorating for him. So we all have that choice.
I wasn't really talking so much about people in the service industry. I was talking about the majority of people in the world that have to walk 3 hours to get water, who live in extreme poverty.
Oh, I see. Oh,
He's
like
talking
that.
about the person in Afghanistan or
right,
Sudan,
yeah.
or who's got all of these other issues.
Yeah.
And how do they find the stillness, or how do they sort of arrive at that?
I mean, my experience, because not as much as you, but I spent a lot of time in war zones and places of great poverty, and I found that people there are very attentive to their inner resources, however you describe it. If you're in Ethiopia, I'd see people walk with just a tiny bag over their shoulder for 3 weeks across the highlands to pay their respects to the holy places, if I'm in India or Haiti or the Philippines. People in almost unimaginably difficult circumstances as far as I'm concerned. But they have some way, whether it's going to church or some community or tending to their family, that's keeping them directed, sometimes more directed than in California. You know, when the Dalai Lama comes to Los Angeles, he's often at great fundraisers filled with Hollywood producers and movie stars, and people will say, how do you deal with the poverty in India? You know, look across this room where people are on their 7th marriage and going to therapists every day and say there's poverty and there's poverty. And it depends upon how, as we've been saying, you choose to direct your attention. But I find people, of course, if you're in Ukraine, where you will be later this week, I mean, it's easy for us to say, meditate 30 minutes, it's not going to happen with the mortars falling. But I do find that people in difficult situations, parts of the world, actually have one way or another developed very strong resources that the rest of us don't have. I remember once I was on a radio show in the US, I was talking about some of these things, and a woman called up, and she was very, very angry. She wasn't in a war zone, but she said, I'm a young mother with 2 little kids, and I'm trying to start a business. All very well for a travel writer in Santa Barbara to talk about this, but how am I going to do this? And when I heard her voice, I thought, as long as she's in that state of agitation, she's not really going to be able to bring anything useful to her kids. If only, and I'm sure she could have done this, for 30 minutes she asked a friend or her mother or her husband to look after the kids. The best thing she could bring to them was actually stepping away from the stress of that situation, even for a short time, so she can come back with better resources. But I think so many of us, myself included, get caught up in these vicious cycles. And all we need is to be jolted out of them, and then suddenly we can attend to them better. It's such a good question, though, because people always think about the majority of people in the world have in situations we can barely imagine.
It's so easy to hate, and it's when you come to places like this that you realize that outside of the negative energy and the negative thoughts and the possibility of hatred, there's also empathy, there's also the possibility of going inward rather than always looking outward. You can learn more by buying Pico's books. He is happy to sign. Sonu Shivdasani, Pico Iyer, thank you so much for this first conversation.
Thank you, Sanjoy.
Today, and thank you all.
Thank you.